Behavioural Economics on a Post-it, number 14. In this little video, I'm going to talk about what's called introjected motivations. I should say, at the outset, that my background is in economics, and behavioural economics really evolved from input from economists and particular branches of psychology, very importantly. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who developed prospect theory, are probably the primary examples of the psychology input into the development of behavioural economics. Behavioural public policy, though, that is to say, I always define it as the application of behavioural science in some way, or input from behavioural science in some way, to considerations of policy design or policy intervention design, etc. That has input from many different disciplines, way beyond economics and those particular branches of psychology. So it could be input from animal behavioralism, anthropology, political science, philosophy, you name it really. It could be an input from practically any disciplinary perspective, certainly within the social sciences and across many of the humanities and probably the natural sciences as well, zoology, for instance. Now, introjected motivations, I associate that principally with what's called self-determination theory, and that was developed by two psychologists, Edward Desai and Richard Ryan, I believe, psychologists that not traditionally associated with input into the development of behavioural economics, but very important, I think, in terms of input into the development of what's called, as I said, what we call behavioural public policy now, this relatively new disciplinary field. Now, it's often assumed that economists believe that individuals are not bothered about anybody else other than themselves, really, that they're only fueled by their own sort of selfish motivations. That's a caricature of what economics as a discipline believes, but let's just go with that for now. And we'll conclude, controversially, I think, that the economists wouldn't see people as being particularly motivated by what other people might think of them. That's the sort of modern caricature of economics. Economics as a discipline does pick up these sorts of things in its historical development. Now, part of self-determination theory is that people, the main part of it, I suppose, is that people can be motivated autonomously by things that they want to do purely for themselves, and that's, if you like, the best way to motivate people. Or it can be motivated through an element of control over their behaviours. And many people think that that's not necessarily the best way to motivate people, but it can be very effective. And introjected motivations are really a part of this almost like innate, probably innate now, aspects of human behaviour whereby that people are controlled to some extent by their feelings of guilt or pride, basically caring about what other people think about what they're doing. That's introjected motivations. You care about your sense of guilt or your sense of pride. You care about what other people think about what you're doing around you. And that can be potentially a very powerful tool in order to motivate people's behaviours in particular directions, if you conclude that's a legitimate aspect of public policy, right? So that's all I've said in this middle box here. We've evolved to care about what others think of us, right? And these incentives can be designed to take advantage of that. So, one common example, I suppose, although you could think of many quite easily, one common, relatively recent example is the placing of a plastic bag charge. So you have to pay for plastic bags if you want to use them. In many countries these days, if you want to take a plastic bag from the supermarket, it used to be free. You could take as many as you want. But they introduced a small plastic bag charge. Very small in the English context initially. It's risen a bit since, but initially it was 5p per bag, right? So you'd imagine that 5p per bag, for most people, would almost be like an immaterial financial disincentive, right? And yet, it's been an enormously effective policy intervention in many countries. You know, the use of plastic bags if you classify effective as just the reduction in the use of plastic bags, then it's been enormously effective. There's been an enormous reduction in plastic bag use in many countries following the introduction of a very small charge for plastic bags. So what is the explanation for that then? We might conclude that it's not really an economic consideration, because the effect was much larger than you would expect from such a small financial disincentive. It could have been serving almost as a reminder for people not to use plastic bags. You know, when they got to the counter and they were reminded that they were using a plastic bag by there being now a 5p charge on each plastic bag. There might be an element of that, you know, people being reminded that using plastic bags is not necessarily a good thing in the moment. Perhaps the biggest motivator, at least initially, was this notion of introjected motivation. So that's supposed to be my little diagram at the top here, sorry for my drawing. But you've got somebody who's using a plastic bag and people looking at him, maybe as he carries this plastic bag around with him. May not be actually looking at it, he just may feel as though people are looking at him or her. And that can engender some feelings of guilt, therefore, right? So you might start feeling guilty about using plastic bags because of the introduction of this 5p plastic bag charge. You're motivated by your perception of what other people think around what you're doing. And that could have been the explanation for, you know, reduction in plastic bag use. And you could think that, you know, perhaps that's this notion of introjected motivations, feelings of guilt about what you're doing, could be an explanation for why there's been large changes in behaviours in other domains over the last 30 or 40 years or so, right? So people much more likely to clean up their dog's mess these days than they were, say, in the 1970s. Maybe they feel guilty, you know, when their dog messes, so at least some people might, and that might motivate them to clean their dog's mess up. Or even smoking behaviours, you know, that's, in some instances, it's become almost, in some countries, it's almost become like a taboo, or I think there's been a bit of a reversal over the recent years, but almost like a taboo to smoke these days, and people feel guilty, perhaps, to do it. They care about what others around them, their perception of what others around them are thinking about their behaviours. Now, ideally, I'll say this very briefly, but ideally you'd want people to go to what's called identified motivations. You'd want them to move from introjected towards almost being autonomous, the behaviour change or the new behaviours being autonomous rather than controlled. That the people have identified motivations, that is to say that they identify with the new behaviour that they're doing. They don't care about what other people think. They just want to, for example, limit their uses of plastic bags because that is what they want to do themselves. They think that that's good in and of themselves. Ideally, that's the position you want to go to eventually, because then you can be reasonably confident that the behaviour change will be sustained into the future. If this is something really what people want to do for themselves, then they're more likely to continue doing that. Okay, so that's behavioural economics, or behavioural public policy on a post-it, number 14, wasn't it? Yep. Introjected motivations.